The courtroom was typical, a stark, sterile room with long wooden benches and an air of quiet authority. Judge William Harper sat behind the bench, his face set in a neutral expression as he scanned the docket for the day. The case in front of him was unremarkable, a minor traffic infraction involving a woman named Tamara Fields. He had seen hundreds of similar cases, and today was no different, until Tamara walked in. She stepped into the room with a quiet grace, wearing a dark blazer and trousers that hinted at her professionalism. Her expression was calm, but her eyes, intelligent and observant, seemed to take in every detail of the room. She was the kind of woman who could easily blend in, but there was something about her that suggested a deeper story, one Harper couldn't quite place. He adjusted his glasses and motioned for her to approach the stand. "Miss Fields," Judge Harper began, his voice steady but with a hint of impatience, "you are here for a traffic violation, is that correct?" Tamara nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper flipped through the case file in front of him, his mind already half distracted by the paperwork. He glanced at the details. Tamara had been caught speeding through a school zone. It was a common case, one he had handled many times before. There was no indication of any significant reason behind her violation, just a simple oversight on her part. He let out a small sigh, ready to proceed. "Ms. Fields, speeding through a school zone is a serious offense," he continued. "We need to ensure that such behavior is addressed properly, especially in areas where children's safety is at risk. You'll be fined accordingly." Tamara kept her composure, standing tall despite the weight of his words. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. Instead, she simply nodded again, her voice steady when she responded. "I understand, Your Honor." Harper noticed the calmness in her demeanor. Most people, when facing fines, would at least try to explain themselves, to plead their case. Not Tamara. She didn't flinch. It was as if this moment was just another small obstacle in a much bigger journey. Harper found himself mildly irritated. Why didn't she care more? Why wasn't she offering any sort of defense? The silence stretched as Harper considered the next steps. In his mind, this was an open and shut case. There was no need for any complicated deliberations. He turned his attention back to her with a sense of finality. "Ms. Fields, given the nature of the violation and the fact that this is your first offense, I'm imposing a fine of $250. He announced, his tone clipped. "Please make arrangements to pay it by the end of the month." Tamara gave a small nod, still maintaining her quiet dignity. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. And just like that, the hearing was over. Harper dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already moving on to the next case. He didn't give Tamara another thought as she walked out of the courtroom. At least, not yet. What Judge Harper didn't know, as he dismissed Tamara Fields without another glance, was that the woman who had just stood before him wasn't someone to be dismissed lightly. Tamara's life was far more complex and impactful than the short interaction in the courtroom suggested. Back at her office, nestled in a bustling federal building, Tamara sat down at her desk, her mind already shifting back to the work that awaited her. As the national coordinator for the Federal Climate Resilience Program, she had a long list of tasks for the day. Her job was to oversee efforts to help communities across the country adapt to the growing threats of climate change. She worked closely with local leaders, engineers, and scientists to devise strategies for reducing the risks of extreme weather, flooding, and rising sea levels. Tamara was part of a team that had been tasked with ensuring vulnerable populations, those living in flood zones, along coasts, or in areas with frequent natural disasters, received the resources they needed to survive and thrive in an increasingly uncertain world. Every decision she made carried weight. When the federal government allocated millions of dollars in grants, it was her responsibility to ensure the funds were used efficiently and reached the right hands. She was a logistical mastermind, orchestrating collaborations between different levels of government, nonprofit organizations, and community leaders. Despite the significance of her role, Tamara was used to people underestimating her. For one, Her quiet demeanor often led people to assume she lacked authority or confidence. That couldn't have been further from the truth. She had worked her way up through the ranks of environmental policy, earning her place at the head of a program that was crucial for the country's future. Her expertise in climate adaptation strategies was unparalleled, and she had spent years earning the respect of her peers. But even with all her accomplishments, Tamara knew the reality of her position. As a black woman in a field dominated by older, often white male figures, she had learned to navigate a world that sometimes seemed stacked against her. The unspoken biases, the subtle dismissals, the doubting glances, she had encountered them all. But she refused to let those barriers define her. Today, like most days, Tamara was on a conference call with state officials, working through the final details of a multi-million-dollar initiative aimed at improving infrastructure in flood-prone areas. Her work was high-stakes, fast-paced, and required constant problem-solving. There was no room for mistakes. She didn't have the luxury of getting distracted by petty matters. Still, as she sat back in her office chair, she couldn't help but replay her brief encounter in court. It had been a routine violation, nothing significant. But something about Judge Harper's disapproving glance had stayed with her. Perhaps it was the way he'd dismissed her so easily, assuming her to be another case file. She shook off the thought. It wasn't the first time someone had misjudged her, and it wouldn't be the last. She had a mission to complete, and she couldn't afford to get caught up in the small moments. What Tamara didn't know was that the judge, who had so swiftly issued a fine, was about to uncover something that would change the way he saw her, and perhaps even the way he saw the world. Later that afternoon, Judge Harper sat at his desk in his chambers, sorting through case files. The courtroom had emptied, the steady hum of the courthouse now replaced with an eerie quiet. He had handled a number of routine cases today, but something about Tamara Field's appearance lingered in his mind. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to her than he had initially assumed. Why had she been so calm, so unflappable, when the fine was issued? Most people would at least try to argue or offer an excuse, perhaps a personal issue, a moment of stress, a reason for why they were caught in a speeding violation. But Tamara hadn't done any of that. She simply accepted her fate with an air of quiet dignity. It was unusual, especially for someone in her position. As he stared at the file in front of him, Harper found himself turning back to her name, Tamara Fields. The name felt strangely familiar, though he couldn't immediately recall why. He had only seen her briefly in the courtroom, but something about her composed nature and poised presence stuck with him. His curiosity piqued. Harper turned to his computer and began typing. Within moments, a search engine pulled up articles and press releases about a Tamara Fields, though he still couldn't be sure it was the same person. As he scrolled, Harper's eyes widened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. There on the screen was her name alongside an initiative that was making headlines across the country. Tamara Fields was a central figure in the federal government's response to the growing climate crisis. As the national coordinator for the Federal Climate Resilience Program, she was responsible for managing one of the most important government initiatives aimed at mitigating the effects of climate change. He read that she was spearheading efforts to develop strategies for protecting vulnerable communities from extreme weather, rising sea levels, and other climate-related challenges. She was working directly with state governments and local leaders to ensure that resources were allocated where they were needed most. Harper leaned back in his chair, a wave of realization washing over him. This woman, this person he had so casually found in his courtroom, was overseeing the national program critical to the future of millions of people. Her work affected infrastructure, policy, and the lives of communities on the front lines of climate change. His initial impression of her as just another case in a long list of names seemed woefully inadequate. A sense of discomfort began to settle over him. How could he have been so quick to dismiss her? The fine he had imposed seemed trivial now, almost out of place. He began to wonder how many times he had made similar judgments in the past, rushing to conclusions based on superficial assessments, unaware of the bigger picture. What if there were other people in his courtroom who, like Tamara, had far more complex lives than he could ever know. Harper's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was his clerk, who handed him a few new files to review. But the judge wasn't focused on the paperwork. His mind kept returning to Tamara Fields, her quiet confidence, and the growing sense that he had just encountered someone far more important than he had realized. He couldn't let it go. Something needed to change, and that change started with him understanding who Tamara Fields really was. Judge Harper spent the rest of the afternoon lost in thought. The case files that had once seemed so urgent and pressing now felt insignificant. His mind kept drifting back to Tamara Fields and the surprising revelations he had uncovered about her. It wasn't like him to let something as trivial as a traffic fine keep him awake at night, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that wouldn't go away. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been to dismiss her so casually. As a judge, Harper prided himself on fairness, but now he couldn't help but wonder if his own assumptions about Tamara had been influenced by preconceived notions. He hadn't asked enough questions. He hadn't looked beyond the surface. And he knew, deep down, that he had made an error in judgment. Unable to shake the sense that he was missing something important, Harper dug deeper. That evening, he found himself combing through articles, interviews, and reports, anything that mentioned Tamara Fields. The more he read, the more he was taken aback by the depth of her accomplishments. Tamara wasn't just a coordinator for a government program. She was leading an initiative with profound implications for the future. Her work spanned the entire country, from coastal towns facing rising sea levels to rural communities grappling with increasingly unpredictable weather patterns. The program she managed wasn't just about funding or policy. It was about saving lives, protecting communities, and building resilience in the face of a rapidly changing world. One article described how Tamara had led a multi-state collaboration to build infrastructure designed to withstand flooding. Another mentioned her efforts in areas devastated by hurricanes, where she had organized teams to help rebuild homes and provide aid to those left without shelter. There was even mention of her spearheading educational campaigns to help everyday citizens understand the importance of climate adaptation. As Harper read on, he found himself struck by the enormity of the task she had taken on. Tamara Fields wasn't just another bureaucrat shuffling paperwork. She was at the forefront of a national effort to protect the most vulnerable from the effects of climate change. She was working tirelessly, often under immense pressure, to make sure that cities and towns were prepared for a future that was rapidly becoming more unpredictable and dangerous. His sense of embarrassment grew as he read more about her personal journey. Tamara had earned degrees from prestigious universities, built a career from the ground up, and fought for a seat at the table in a field that had traditionally excluded people like her, black women in environmental science and policy. She had faced her share of obstacles, but instead of retreating, she had pushed forward, becoming a respected leader in her field. Judge Harper sat back in his chair, his eyes lingering on the screen. He felt a growing sense of humility. How could he have missed all of this? How had he been so blind to the true significance of the woman he had so easily found? In that moment, Harper understood something that would change his perspective forever. People were rarely just what they appeared to be on the surface, and Tamara Fields was a perfect example of that truth. The realization hit Judge Harper like a cold wave. He had spent most of his career upholding the law with a sense of detachment, seeing each case as a simple matter of right and wrong, black and white. But as he sat in his office, rereading the articles about Tamara Fields, he began to feel the weight of the assumptions he had made earlier that day. How many other cases had he judged without fully understanding the lives behind the people in his courtroom? How many times had he jumped to conclusions, seeing only what was in front of him, and not the complexities that lay beneath? Harper stared at the screen in front of him, reflecting on his actions. He had fined Tamara for a minor speeding violation, a decision that now seemed absurd. There was no consideration of the person she was, the woman leading a federal program designed to protect communities from the devastating effects of climate change. He had seen only a small part of her life, the part that had been before him in the courtroom. He hadn't asked questions or looked for deeper context. Instead, he had assumed she was just another person caught in a traffic jam, someone who could be swiftly dealt with. The more he thought about it, the more Harper became uncomfortable with his own behavior. Was this how he treated everyone who didn't fit into the mold of what he expected? Was he blind to the bigger picture, caught in the mechanics of his position, rather than the human lives that came through his doors? His mind turned back to Tamara's calm, composed demeanor. She had accepted the fine without a word of protest, but there was something about her that seemed to suggest there was far more going on in her life than he could possibly comprehend. Maybe that's why she hadn't bothered to explain herself. She had nothing to prove to him. Perhaps she had grown tired of explaining herself to people who couldn't see beyond the surface. Harper sat back in his chair, his thoughts spinning. He had always prided himself on being fair, but in this instance, he realized he had been anything but. He had been quick to judge, quick to impose a penalty, without understanding the deeper context of her life and her work. How many others had been at the receiving end of similar judgments? People who were doing vital work, people who faced challenges that Harper could never fully grasp. There was a growing sense of shame within him, and it was starting to become clear that this moment wasn't just about one woman. It was about the broader responsibility he carried as a judge. His job wasn't simply about enforcing the law. It was about seeing the bigger picture, about understanding the complexities of each case and the lives behind it. If he failed to do that, if he continued to view people through a narrow lens, then he wasn't doing justice. Harper knew what he had to do. He needed to make things right with Tamara Fields. The fine was insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but the principle was not. He had made an error in judgment, and he couldn't just let it slide. The following morning, Judge Harper sat at his desk, staring at the file with Tamara's name on it. He had spent most of the night mulling over his decision, and a growing sense of unease weighed heavily on him. The more he reflected, the more he realized that issuing the fine had been a superficial, hasty decision, one that didn't take into account the real person behind the case. He couldn't simply move on from it. He needed to make amends. After some internal debate, he picked up the phone and dialed the number he had found in his research. He was unsure of how she would react. How could he explain the embarrassment he felt, or justify his sudden desire to reconnect over a simple speeding ticket? But he had no other choice. He knew he had to try to make things right, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. When the phone rang, Tamara's calm voice greeted him on the other end. "Hello, this is Tamara Fields." "Ms. Fields," Harper began, his tone more tentative than he had anticipated. "This is Judge William Harper. I'm calling about the fine I imposed on you yesterday." There was a slight pause on the line before she responded. "Yes, I remember. I appreciate you taking the time to follow up, but I've already made arrangements for payment. Is there something else I can assist you with?" Her polite but distant tone gave Harper pause. He could tell she was used to dealing with people who were only concerned with formalities, and he wasn't sure how to break through that barrier. "I'd like to request a meeting, if that's possible," he said, his voice more measured now. "I've been thinking a lot about our brief encounter in court, and I realize I may have been hasty in my judgment. I'd like the chance to explain and to hear your side of things, if you're open to it." There was a long silence before Tamara spoke again. Harper could hear her take a deep breath. "I'm not sure what you're hoping to hear, Judge. I understand the role you play, and the fine was fair." "I accept that." Harper's heart sank a little. Her response was kind but resigned, as if she was used to people not fully understanding her or her work. "I know you do," he replied softly. "But I've come to realize that I didn't see the full picture yesterday. I didn't understand who you were or the work you're doing. And I should have." Tamara paused again, and Harper could almost feel her weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she sighed. "All right, Judge Harper. I'll meet with you. But I warn you, this isn't going to be a simple conversation." "Thank you, Miss Fields," he said, relief flooding through him. "I look forward to it." As they arranged a time to meet, Harper felt an unexpected sense of anticipation. He wasn't sure what the meeting would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about a traffic fine. It was about something far more important: understanding, learning, and perhaps even growing. For the first time in a long while, Judge Harper felt the weight of his position in a way that was more personal than professional. He wasn't just a judge. He was a human being, and it was time to start seeing the people who came before him as whole, complex individuals, not just cases to be closed. The day of the meeting arrived with a sense of anticipation that Harper couldn't quite shake. He had spent the last few days thinking about what to say to Tamara Fields. His initial approach had been one of apology, but now he was realizing it needed to be more than that. He needed to listen, to understand, to step outside the world he had lived in for so long, a world of quick judgments and rigid rules, and truly see the person sitting across from him. Harper arrived at the small cafe where they had agreed to meet a little early. He sat at a table by the window, watching the passers-by as he tried to calm his nerves. He hadn't expected this to be easy. In fact, he wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get from Tamara. She had every right to be guarded with him. After all, in her eyes, he was just another authority figure, another person who had assumed something about her without understanding the full story. When Tamara walked into the cafe, it was hard for Harper not to notice the contrast between her composed demeanor and the intensity of her work. She exuded confidence, but there was an underlying weariness in her eyes, an exhaustion that seemed to come not from her work, but from the constant need to prove herself to a world that often doubted her capabilities. She walked up to the table and extended her hand. "Judge Harper," she said with a nod, "I didn't expect you to reach out, but I'm here. Let's talk." Harper stood to shake her hand, the weight of his past decision pressing heavily on his chest. "Thank you for meeting with me, Ms. Fields," he said. "I know this might be uncomfortable, but I truly want to hear your side of things." Tamara sat down across from him, folding her arms as she studied him for a moment. "I'm listening," she said, her voice calm but laced with a quiet wariness. Harper took a deep breath before speaking. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice steady but regretful. "When you stood before me in that courtroom, I saw only a minor infraction. I didn't see the person behind the case. I didn't take the time to understand your work or the significance of what you do. I made a snap judgment, and that was unfair." Tamara's expression remained unreadable, but her eyes softened slightly. "You're right," she said quietly. "Most people don't see me for what I am. They see a black woman, and they expect me to fit into a certain box. I've spent most of my life proving that I'm more than that. That's why I didn't try to explain myself in court. It's exhausting to always have to justify your existence." Harper swallowed, feeling a pang of guilt. "I can only imagine how frustrating that must be." Tamara nodded. "It's part of the job, I suppose, but it's also part of being a person in a world that tends to overlook your humanity." Harper felt a shift in the air, a moment of understanding that hadn't been there before. He realized that this wasn't just about him apologizing. It was about recognizing the systemic biases that had shaped both of their lives, even if they hadn't always been aware of them. "I can't undo the past," Harper said, his voice quieter now. "But I promise I'll do better. I'll be more mindful of the full picture, the person standing before me, not just the case." Tamara leaned back in her chair, considering his words. "I appreciate that. But it's not just about your decisions, Judge Harper. It's about a system that too often fails to see people like me for who we truly are." Harper nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning. "I agree," he said, "and I think that's something we both need to work on changing." For the first time since their meeting began, Tamara smiled, not a forced smile, but one that felt genuine. "Maybe so," she said, her tone lighter. "Maybe so." In that moment, Harper realized that this wasn't just an apology. It was the beginning of a deeper conversation, one that would challenge both of them to see the world differently and perhaps to change the way they moved through it. The meeting with Tamara Fields was a turning point for Judge Harper, one that reshaped the way he viewed not only the people who came before him in the courtroom, but also the world around him. As he left the cafe, he felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for years. The realization that he had been blind to the complexity of others' lives, to the hidden layers of their identities, weighed heavily on him. But it also ignited a spark, a desire to change, to be more than just a figure of authority, but someone who truly understood the impact of his decisions. In the days that followed, Harper began to take a closer look at the people in his courtroom. He observed how quickly he had once written off their stories, their struggles, based solely on a few details in their case files. He started asking more questions about their lives, their work, their challenges, seeking a deeper understanding of who they were. It wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but Harper knew it was necessary. As for Tamara, she continued her work, focused on the monumental task of leading the federal climate resilience program. Her dedication to the cause hadn't wavered, but she noticed a subtle shift in the way people treated her. After her meeting with Judge Harper, she began to see a change in the way some of her colleagues responded to her. Less skepticism, more respect. It was a quiet victory, but one that spoke volumes. Though the encounter had started as an apology from Harper, it had become something much more significant, a mutual acknowledgement of the challenges each of them faced in a world that often struggled to see beyond surface-level assumptions. In their conversation, Tamara had shared the frustrations of constantly being underestimated, while Harper had come to terms with his own role in perpetuating those biases. But beyond the exchange of words, there had been a shared understanding. Both of them had work to do. Both of them had systems to challenge. In the months that followed, Judge Harper's courtroom began to reflect the shift in his thinking. He paid more attention to the stories people told him, acknowledging the circumstances that shaped their lives. His rulings were still firm, but they came from a place of greater empathy. He realized that justice wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about understanding the people affected by those laws and working to ensure that their voices were heard. Tamara, meanwhile, continued to lead her program with the same unwavering commitment, but she also found herself more willing to speak up in spaces where her voice had previously been dismissed. Whether it was in a meeting with government officials or in a community outreach session, Tamara spoke with a renewed sense of confidence, not because she was trying to prove herself, but because she knew that her work, her expertise, and her perspective mattered. In the end, the small infraction that had set everything in motion, seemed trivial. But the conversation it sparked between Tamara and Judge Harper changed both of their lives in profound ways. They had each learned to see beyond the labels, beyond the judgments, and to understand that everyone has a story worth hearing. And in doing so, they had both taken a step toward a more just and compassionate world.